My stepfather threw away my dad's watch and told the neighbors I was stealing from my mother. When I begged my mom to see what he was doing to me, she looked through me and said, "Why can't you just be grateful?" I stayed silent. That was 9 months ago. This morning, he was standing outside my new school fence, watching me breathe through an oxygen mask. My buddy Carter was the kind of kid who'd eat the burnt pancakes so you didn't have to. Eagle Scout at 14, he stayed after the school events until 3 a.m. just to help janitors stack chairs. The kind of guy who learned EMT training, not because he was interested in it, but because he might need it one day. His dad took his own life junior year, OD'd in the garage while Carter was at a shelter handing out free meals to the homeless. His dad left a note about Carter's mom and his best friend Bill, about how Carter wasn't his and how the affair had been happening for almost 20 years. But by the time Carter found his dad's body, his mom had already burned the note. At the funeral, she told everyone his dad had been secretly depressed. The whole town bought it. Bill moved in 3 months later. To help with bills, his mom said. Carter needs a father figure, she said. At the funeral, Bill had given the eulogy about losing his best friend. Now he slept in his best friend's bed. The wedding was small, quick. Carter was the ring bearer. That's when the erasure started. Carter came home from school to find his dad's things boxed in the garage. Trophies from coaching Carter's little league, father-son camping photos, his dad's cologne, Carter. "We need to move forward," Bill said. "Your mom needs this." His mom nodded. Xanax glazed, wine glass at noon. Carter found his dad's watch, the one Grandpa gave him, in the garbage. Bill caught him digging it out. "Stealing from your mother now?" Loud enough for the neighbors to hear. The beatings started carefully. Bill had been a cop 2 towns over and knew exactly where bruises wouldn't show, how long they'd last. Open-handed to not leave knuckle marks. Never the face during school months. Always when mom was passed out on her new prescription cocktail that Bill's doctor friend provided. "Double the normal dose," Carter heard him tell her once. "You've been through so much." She'd wake up to Carter crying, Bill comforting him about his nightmares. She started sleeping through Carter's screams. First parent-teacher conference, Bill played concerned stepfather perfectly. Showed Carter's teachers videos on his phone. Carter screaming, throwing things, having episodes. What the videos didn't show was the 2 hours before, Bill's hands around Carter's throat, telling him his dad was a coward who chose death over raising a disappointment. "We're getting him help," Bill told the teachers. "It's been so hard since his father's troubles." They looked at Carter with pity, the troubled kid with the suicidal father. Bill's therapist friend diagnosed Carter with complicated grief disorder and oppositional defiance. Official papers filed with the school. The pills made Carter's hands shake, his words slur. When he tried to tell the school counselor about Bill, she wrote down delusional episodes and projecting unresolved father issues, called Bill to pick him up early. That night's beating was the worst yet. The Columbia scholarship his dad had started saving for when Carter was born, Bill managed it now. Spent it on his own kids from his first marriage who visited weekends, called Carter psycho at the dinner table, while Bill smiled. When Carter's grandmother asked about college funds at Thanksgiving, Bill pulled out forged bank statements showing Carter had been stealing from it. "We didn't want to worry you," he told her, hand on Carter's mom's sedated shoulder. "We're handling it." Grandma stopped calling. Thursday before Thanksgiving break, Carter finally snapped, grabbed Bill's wrist mid-swing, pushed him backward. Bill fell into the coffee table, tiny cut on his forehead, called 911. "My stepson attacked me. I think he's having a psychotic break. His father committed suicide. Please hurry, I'm scared." Cops who knew Bill from the force showed up. Carter in handcuffs on his own lawn. Domestic incident on the report. School resource officer pulled Carter aside Monday. "We're watching you now." The thing about his mom was the hardest. She'd wake up sometimes, almost lucid, look at Carter like she wanted to say something. Then Bill would hand her the pills, kiss her forehead, and she'd fade again. The night Carter begged her, really begged, on his knees, to see what was happening, she looked at him with nothing behind her eyes and said, "Why can't you just be grateful?" That's when Bill started the checks. Random body searches for doctorgs, weapons, made Carter strip in the living room. This is what happens to criminals in jail. You want to act like one? Get treated like one. Hands everywhere they shouldn't be. Your dad never taught you how to be a man. Someone has to. Carter stood there, 14 years old, naked in his own house, Bill's phone recording for documentation of compliance. I was at their house the day before Thanksgiving. Bill answered the door, big smile, firm handshake. Carter's upstairs doing homework. You know how we have to stay on him about his grades now. Carter's room looked wrong. Bare walls, no lock on the door, mattress on the floor. "Where's all your stuff?" I asked. Carter just stared at nothing. Same look his dad probably had at the end. His phone buzzed. Bill calling him down for dinner. Carter walked to his closet, pushed aside the hanging clothes. His dad's hunting rifle was propped in the corner, the one Bill didn't know he'd hidden. Box of shells underneath his old scout uniform. "I think it's best if you head out," he told me. I walked out of Carter's room and down the stairs, my legs feeling like they weren't attached to my body. Bill was in the kitchen talking to Susan about needing to check Carter's room for stolen property later. Susan just nodded at whatever he said, her eyes glazed over from whatever pills he'd given her. I mumbled something about homework and headed for the door. Bill's hand landed on my shoulder just as I reached for the handle. "Everything okay up there?" he asked, his grip tightening just enough to hurt. I nodded and pulled away, practically running to my car. I sat there in the driveway for a minute, engine running, hands shaking so bad I could barely grip my phone. The image of that rifle kept flashing in my head, Carter's dead eyes matching the look I'd seen in old photos of his dad near the end. I dialed 911, and my thumb hovered over the call button. Then I remembered the cops who'd shown up when Carter pushed Bill, how they'd shaken Bill's hand and called him brother. I hung up before it could ring. I drove for 30 minutes to the county sheriff's office in the next town over, avoiding the Millbrook PD completely since half of them played poker with Bill on Fridays. The desk sergeant looked at me like I was wasting his time when I started explaining about the rifle. But when I mentioned Bill's name, his expression changed. "Bill Lawson?" he asked, leaning forward. He called over Detective Rachel Torres, a woman with sharp eyes who'd apparently been watching Bill since some incident at his last precinct that got buried. She listened to everything, taking notes, asking specific questions about dates and times. 2 hours later, Torres and I pulled up to Carter's house again. Every light was on, and we could hear Bill's voice booming from inside about missing property and ungrateful kids. Through the living room window, I saw Carter on his knees while Bill stormed around upstairs, throwing things and yelling about respect. Torres called for backup from state police, specifically requesting units from outside Millbrook. 3 state trooper cars pulled up 15 minutes later. Bill came out all smiles and handshakes until he spotted Torres. His face went hard when she mentioned they were doing a welfare check on Carter. "The boy's troubled," Bill started saying. "His father's suicide." But Torres cut him off and said she needed to speak with Carter alone. Bill's jaw clenched, but he couldn't refuse with 3 state troopers watching. Carter sat in Torres's unmarked car, not saying a word, just staring at his hands folded in his lap. I pulled out my phone and showed Torres the videos I'd been taking for months without really knowing why. Carter's bruises after Bill's talks, his hands shaking so bad he couldn't hold a pencil. His mom passed out on the couch at 2 in the afternoon. Torres's expression got darker with each video. "When did you take this one?" she asked about a video of Carter changing his shirt, purple marks across his ribs. The state troopers found the rifle in Carter's closet exactly where I'd told them it would be. Bill immediately started saying Carter must have stolen it, that he was planning something violent just like his father. Susan stumbled out to the living room, barely able to stand, and mumbled agreement to whatever Bill was saying. Torres documented everything, especially taking photos of Susan's condition and the pill bottles on the coffee table. It was almost 11 when Carter finally came to stay at my house that night. My parents had agreed immediately when Torres called them. Carter didn't eat the sandwich my mom made, didn't talk when my dad tried to ask if he needed anything, just sat wrapped in my mom's old quilt, staring at nothing. My parents kept exchanging worried looks, but gave him space. The next morning, Thanksgiving Day, Torres called while we were setting the table. She'd been digging into Bill's past all night and found 2 excessive force complaints at his old department, both involving minors, both mysteriously dropped. She needed Carter to talk, but without his testimony, her hands were tied. Bill had already called in favors, telling people I was a bad influence who was filling Carter's head with lies. During Thanksgiving dinner, right in the middle of my mom serving mashed potatoes, Carter suddenly started sobbing. Not quiet tears, but full body-shaking sobs. My mom held him while he whispered about the body searches, about Bill making him strip down while recording it, about how his mom looked right through him now like he didn't exist. My dad quietly stepped outside to call Torres. "I'm really curious about the timeline here. Bill moved in just 3 months after the dad died, but somehow he'd already set up this whole system with the doctor friend and the therapist." Friday morning, Torres arranged for Carter to see Dr. Michael Foster at the county hospital, specifically choosing a place where Bill had no connections. The examination took 3 hours. Dr. Foster found old fractures in Carter's ribs that had healed wrong, bruising in specific patterns that meant someone knew exactly where to hit, defensive wounds on his arms. Foster, as a mandated reporter, started filling out the official documentation while Carter sat there in a hospital gown, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. Detective Torres got Carter released into temporary protective custody that night, and my parents agreed to let him stay with us while the legal stuff got sorted out. Friday afternoon around 4, I was upstairs helping Carter unpack when my mom called up that someone was at the door. Through my bedroom window, I saw Bill's truck in our driveway with 2 Millbrook police cruisers behind it. My dad was already on the porch when Bill started demanding Carter come home immediately. The 2 officers with him looked uncomfortable, shifting their weight while Bill waved papers around. My mom stood behind my dad with her arms crossed. Bill pulled out his phone and played a recording from weeks ago, Carter's voice screaming and crying after one of the beatings, though the recording only caught Carter's reaction, not what caused it. The officers exchanged glances, and one stepped forward saying Carter had to go with his legal guardian. My dad asked to see their warrant. They didn't have one, but said domestic situations didn't always require one. That's when Detective Torres pulled up in an unmarked county car. She got out holding a folder and walked straight past Bill to show the officers her emergency custody order signed by a county judge 2 hours earlier. Bill's face went red, and he started arguing about jurisdiction, saying these were his local officers and county had no authority here. Torres pulled out her phone and called someone, and within 10 minutes, 2 state police cars arrived. The state troopers reviewed both sets of paperwork, while Carter watched from my window, his hands gripping the windowsill so tight his knuckles went white. After 20 minutes of back and forth, the state police sided with the county order. Bill had to leave, but as he walked past my dad, he said quietly enough that only we could hear it, that this wasn't over. The whole neighborhood had come out to watch by then. 3 days later on Monday, Carter went back to school with a county social worker named Ms. Rodriguez following him around. Word had already spread about what happened at my house. Kids whispered in the hallways, and even teachers who used to smile at Carter now kept their distance. Bill's version had made it through the parent phone tree over the weekend, painting Carter as a disturbed kid who'd threatened his family with his dead father's gun. Even Mr. Harrison, who'd coached Carter in track, wouldn't make eye contact. Ms. Huang found Carter during lunch and brought him to her office. She'd spent the weekend going through his file, marking the timeline of behavior reports that all started after his dad died, right when Bill moved in. She showed Carter the pattern on her laptop screen, how his grades and conduct were perfect until that exact point. She gave him her personal cell number written on a sticky note and told him her office door was always open. Tuesday morning, Susan showed up at school looking more awake than she had in months. Her hands shook as she signed papers Bill had prepared, telling the principal that Carter needed intensive psychiatric treatment for his violent delusions about Bill. Carter watched from Ms. Huang's office window as his mom nodded along to whatever the principal was saying. Ms. Rodriguez tried to intervene, but Susan had legal custody rights that hadn't been terminated yet. Wednesday after school, I started documenting everything with my girlfriend Sarah, whose mom had treated Carter at the urgent care 6 months earlier and noticed bruising that didn't match his story about falling off his bike. Sarah helped me organize photos of Carter's old injuries that I'd taken with my phone, screenshots of his texts about Bill, and a timeline we built going back to his dad's death. We uploaded everything to 3 different cloud services and gave Ms. Huang the login information. Thursday morning, Dr. Brennan showed up at school with commitment papers claiming Carter posed an immediate danger to himself and others. Ms. Huang challenged the evaluation since Brennan hadn't actually examined Carter in over 2 months. The principal didn't know what to do and kept wringing his hands while Brennan insisted he had the legal authority. Detective Torres was in court testifying on another case and couldn't be reached. Carter locked himself in the bathroom and wouldn't come out. Ms. Huang called Dr. Foster from the hospital, who drove over immediately. He reviewed Brennan's assessment right there in the principal's office, pointing out that the dates were wrong, the diagnostic codes didn't match the symptoms described, and the whole thing looked like it had been filled out in advance. The principal finally said he needed the school district's lawyer to review everything before making any decision. Friday night, Carter stayed at his Aunt Patricia's house, his dad's sister who'd driven up from Delaware when she heard what was happening. She showed us photo albums from before, Carter and his dad camping, fishing, just normal father and son stuff. Then she mentioned how Carter's dad had called her 2 weeks before he died, asking strange questions about Bill's past, whether she remembered him from high school, whether there had been any rumors. The room got quiet. Saturday morning, Frank Mitchell pulled into Patricia's driveway in his old pickup truck, having driven straight through from Pittsburgh after getting weird calls from Susan that didn't make sense, her words slurred and confused. When he saw Carter's weight loss and the dark circles under his eyes, his jaw clenched the same way Carter's dad's used to when he was angry. He sat down next to Carter and said his son had called him 2 weeks before everything happened, said he'd found something about Bill that didn't add up. Frank pulled out an old folder from his jacket with bank statements, showing Bill had been stealing from the police pension fund at his old department. That's why he'd really left, not for a better opportunity like he told everyone. Frank's son had tracked down Bill's old partner, who'd been keeping copies of everything for years, waiting for someone to care. Sunday morning, Susan called me asking to meet at the diner on Route 22, said Bill was at his brother's watching football. She sat alone in a back booth with just one coffee cup, her hands steady for once, eyes clearer than I'd seen them in months. When I explained about the rifle and what Carter had been planning, her face went white, then red, then she started shaking her head. She kept saying no over and over, but then her voice got quieter, and she mentioned waking up once at 3 in the morning to find Bill going through her first husband's papers in the basement. She'd asked what he was doing, and he'd given her 2 pills and a glass of water, told her she was having another episode. The next morning, those papers were gone, and Bill said she'd imagined the whole thing. Monday came fast with the emergency custody hearing at the county courthouse. Bill showed up with 3 lawyers in expensive suits, plus 5 character witnesses from the police force, all in uniform. Our side had Detective Torres, Dr. Foster, who documented Carter's injuries, Ms. Huang from school, and a public defender who looked about 12 years old. Bill took the stand first, playing videos on a big screen showing Carter screaming and throwing things during what he called episodes. The videos were edited though, cutting out the parts where Bill had been choking him minutes before. The judge, who I recognized from newspaper photos of him golfing with the police chief, nodded along to everything Bill said. Bill talked about Carter's deteriorating mental state, how he'd tried everything to help his troubled stepson, how it broke his heart to see the boy following his father's path. That's when Carter stood up. He pulled his shirt up over his head, showing the pattern of bruises across his ribs, the healing cuts on his back, the finger marks on his throat. The whole courtroom went silent. Carter's voice came out clear and steady when he said Bill told him no one would believe him, that his dad was weak for killing himself, that Carter would be next. Bill's lawyer jumped up objecting, but everyone had already seen. The judge called a recess, and when we came back, he granted continued emergency custody to the state, but ordered family therapy and supervised visits starting immediately. Bill's face stayed calm in court, but I could see his jaw grinding. His hands clenched so tight, his knuckles went white. Outside on the courthouse steps, he grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks and leaned in close. His breath smelled like coffee and rage when he said I'd destroyed his family and Susan would never forgive me. I pulled out my phone right there and took photos of the red marks his fingers left on my skin. 2 weeks later, Carter started seeing Dr. Amanda Smith, a trauma specialist from the next county with no connections to Bill's network. She had him draw pictures at first, since talking was hard. Then slowly, he started explaining how Bill had taken everything away piece by piece. She documented every session, building a medical record that couldn't be disputed or destroyed. A month passed with Carter getting stronger, while Bill switched tactics completely. January came, and Bill started showing up at every school event with Susan on his arm, her eyes glazed again from whatever new pills he'd gotten her on. He volunteered for the PTA, brought homemade cookies to bake sales, coached the junior varsity basketball team. Parents who didn't know the truth started asking why that poor man's stepson wouldn't come home. What kind of child abandons their family like that? Carter standing up and showing those bruises in court? That took more guts than eating burnt pancakes ever did. Bill's lawyer probably wished he'd objected before the shirt came off, not after everyone saw the evidence written across Carter's ribs. Bill made sure to look sad and worried whenever anyone asked about Carter. Then someone broke into my car while I was at work, smashed the window, and took my laptop with all the evidence files on it. The security cameras at my office parking lot were mysteriously not working that day. The footage corrupted somehow, but my friend Sarah had backed up everything to her cloud storage the night before when she was helping me organize the files. We didn't tell anyone about the backup, letting Bill think he'd won that round. Carter's grades started slipping as the stress ate at him, getting C's and D's on tests he would have aced before. His teachers, who'd been supportive at first, grew frustrated with his lack of focus, not understanding that he couldn't concentrate when every car that looked like Bill's made him panic. Bill sent concerned emails to the principal about Carter's academic decline, suggesting military school might provide the structure the boy clearly needed. The principal forwarded the suggestion to social services, adding his own concerns about Carter's future. Frank wasn't giving up, though, and hired a private investigator with his retirement savings. The PI found sealed records from Bill's first marriage, showing a restraining order his ex-wife had filed, allegations of abuse, custody lost after their daughter showed up at school with bruises. But sealed meant we couldn't use them in family court, couldn't even mention them without risking contempt charges. Frank kept digging anyway, calling Bill's ex-wife's family, tracking down old neighbors, building a picture of who Bill really was. Week 8 came, and Susan started individual therapy as part of the court order with Dr. Patricia Kim, a therapist the court appointed who wasn't part of Bill's network. Susan talked about waking up in different clothes than she remembered putting on, finding her car keys in strange places, whole days missing from her memory. Dr. Kim started documenting everything, noting symptoms consistent with being drugged without consent, building her own medical record about what was really happening in that house. 3 days later, Carter's Aunt Lisa called me crying. Someone had spray painted home wrecker and kidnapper across her garage door in red paint that dripped down like blood. Her neighbors wouldn't even look at her anymore when she walked to her car. The worst part came that evening when she found her cat dead on the porch with a note stabbed through it that said, "Stop interfering with families." The cops took pictures and filed a report, but there were no prints and no witnesses, and Bill had been at work all day with 20 people who could swear to it. The next morning, I got called down to the principal's office, where 2 detectives were waiting with a folder full of photos. Someone had sent an anonymous tip about an inappropriate relationship between me and Carter. They had pictures of us hugging outside my house, him coming over late at night, me driving him places. The way they asked their questions made my skin crawl. My mom got there within 10 minutes and had our lawyer on the phone before they could ask another question. The investigation went on for 2 weeks, and even though they found nothing, kids at school started looking at me different, and parents whispered when I walked past. Ms. Huang started watching Carter more carefully during their sessions and noticed how he'd flinch whenever male teachers walked behind him or got too close. She documented the way his whole body would tense up when anyone touched him without warning. When she asked him about Bill's body searches, he broke down and told her things that made her hands shake as she wrote them down. She filed a new CPS report that afternoon, marking it as potential sexual abuse, which opened a whole different kind of investigation. That same week, my parents got pulled over 3 times for broken taillights that weren't broken and expired registration that wasn't expired. Lisa got 4 tickets in 5 days for things like going 27 in a 25 zone. Dr. Foster came out of the hospital to find his car keyed with "Mind Your Business" scratched into the hood. Every single person helping Carter was getting the message loud and clear. Susan missed her next supervised visit with Carter because they found her passed out in her car in a grocery store parking lot at 2 in the afternoon. The hospital ran tests and found medication levels that should have killed her. Patricia Kim's notes about chemical restraint suddenly looked a lot more serious. Bill showed up at the hospital playing the worried husband and told everyone Susan had been stealing his prescriptions because she couldn't handle losing Carter. 2 weeks later, during a supervised visit at the courthouse, Susan waited until Bill went to the bathroom and pressed a folded piece of paper into Carter's hand. Her hands were shaking so bad she could barely hold it. "Check Dad's storage unit 47B, she whispered. He knew. The second the words left her mouth, she looked confused, like she didn't know what she'd just said. Bill came back and saw the paper in Carter's hand, and his whole face changed. He grabbed Susan's arm hard enough to leave marks and said they were leaving. The detective got a call that night from someone at Bill's old precinct who wanted to talk, but not on the record. Turns out Bill had left under voluntary resignation after an incident with a 16-year-old suspect that nobody wanted to talk about officially. There were 3 other complaints in his file that had been buried. Still nothing they could use in court, but the pattern was getting clearer. Carter's therapy sessions were getting harder because he finally admitted what he'd been thinking about. Not hurting himself, but hurting Bill. He told Dr. Johnson about the dreams where he used his dad's rifle, about the plans he'd made, about how sometimes it was the only thing that made him feel better. She wrote it all down and marked her file with concerns about escalation, but also noted that talking about it seemed to help him let go of some of the rage. Frank's private investigator had been digging into Bill's finances and found out he'd been drowning in debt before he married Susan. $60,000 in credit cards, 2 mortgages behind, his car about to be repossessed. 2 months after the wedding, Susan's life insurance policy got changed with Bill as the only beneficiary for $2 million. The same week, she started seeing Bill's doctor friend for anxiety and got prescribed enough medication to tranquilize a horse. Valentine's Day came, and Carter asked me to go with him to check something out. We drove to a storage facility on the edge of town and found Unit 47B registered under his dad's name. The lock was rusty, but Carter had bolt cutters in his backpack. Inside were boxes of his dad's stuff that Bill had supposedly thrown away, but underneath everything was a metal box with a combination lock. Carter knew the code because it was the same one his dad used for everything. Inside was a single envelope with Carter's name on it. The note inside wasn't about affairs or Bill sleeping with Susan. It was about Bill stealing from the business, about threats Bill had made, about Susan being scared for her life. At the bottom, his dad had written, "If something happens to me, Bill Lawson did it," and the date was 2 days before he died. My hands shook, holding that piece of paper, while Carter just stood there frozen, staring at his dad's actual handwriting. I took photos of everything with my phone, then called Frank, who said, "Get to the police station right now, but not the local one. Go to county, because Bill's friends wouldn't be there." Detective Torres met us in the parking lot at 7 in the morning, and when she saw the note, her whole face changed. She took it straight to their forensics people, who spent 3 hours checking the handwriting against samples from Carter's dad's business records Frank brought. The match came back perfect. Every letter, every curve, and Torres opened a suspicious death investigation right there, but pulled us into a room and closed the door. She said Bill had 3 cops ready to swear he was at a poker game that night, and his doctor friend already submitted records showing Carter's dad had been getting antidepressants for months, even though Susan said he never took any pills. We needed more than one note to prove murder. Susan was in therapy that week with Patricia. When something weird happened, she started remembering things she hadn't before because Patricia had been slowly reducing her medications. Susan suddenly said Bill made all the funeral arrangements while she was basically unconscious on pills, and she remembered him insisting on cremation even though her husband always said he wanted to be buried next to his parents. Bill handled everything she kept saying over and over while Patricia wrote it all down and noted how Susan's memory improved when the drugs wore off. Carter sat in Frank's living room that night, reading his father's note again and again, tracing the words with his finger. He wasn't crying anymore, just whispering that his dad didn't leave them. He was trying to protect them, and all that guilt Carter carried for months turned into something else. He wanted to speak at the custody hearing, wanted everyone to know the truth. Week 14 came, and the private investigator Frank hired finally tracked down Bill's ex-wife Margaret, living 3 states away under her maiden name. She agreed to a video call, and her story made my skin crawl because it was exactly what Bill did to Susan. The gradual medication increases, cutting her off from family, taking control of all the money. Margaret only escaped when her brother physically drove to their house and carried her out while Bill was at work. The school board meeting happened next week, and Bill showed up with a petition signed by 40 parents calling Carter dangerous and unstable, saying their kids didn't feel safe. Something feels off about Susan suddenly remembering the storage unit number during that visit. How does someone that drugged forget everything else but manage to pass along such specific information? Makes me wonder if she's been playing a longer game than we realize, maybe. But Ms. Huang stood up with 3 folders of documentation showing Carter's grades before Bill moved in versus after. Dr. Foster presented medical evidence of abuse patterns, and the board couldn't decide anything, so they tabled it for later. Then Susan disappeared after a therapy appointment, and nobody could find her for 12 hours until Patricia tracked her phone to Bill's doctor friend's house, where she was passed out on a couch with 3 new prescription bottles in her purse. Susan had no memory of going there, didn't remember leaving therapy, and Patricia filed an emergency report about medical abuse that same night. Week 16. Margaret agreed to give a sworn statement about everything Bill did to her, describing the exact same escalation pattern, the same control tactics, the same medication abuse. Torres started building a behavioral pattern case that didn't need to prove murder, just showed Bill's history of domestic abuse across multiple victims. Carter went back to school full-time with a modified schedule, and some kids supported him while others stayed away like he had some disease. He joined Ms. Huang's peer counseling group and started helping younger kids recognize abuse signs, his grades slowly getting better each week. Frank kept digging through financial records and found Bill had accessed Carter's father's business accounts 2 days after the death, draining $30,000 before Susan could even think about money. The forensic accountant traced every transaction, and Torres said this gave her probable cause for a fraud investigation, which meant she could get warrants for everything. I was pumping gas at the station on Maple Street when Bill pulled up behind me. No other cars around, nobody else at the pumps. He walked over real slow and stood too close, saying quietly that I thought I was smart, but accidents happen all the time. My parents drove that route to work every day. Carter's aunt lived alone in that house with no alarm system. I kept my phone recording in my pocket while he talked about how tragic it would be if something happened to the people trying to destroy his family, his wedding ring clicking against my car as he tapped it. I recorded everything on my phone while backing away slowly and driving straight to the police station. The county detective took my statement and played the recording 3 times, writing notes about threats and witness intimidation. 2 weeks later, Dr. Brennan got a letter from the medical board about his license review and suddenly changed his whole story about Carter. He sat in the county courthouse conference room sweating through his shirt while telling investigators Bill had given him specific things to write about Carter's mental state. Without Brennan backing up the diagnosis papers, Bill's lawyers couldn't use them in court anymore. Week 18. Susan asked to see Carter at the supervised visitation center downtown. She sat across from him crying and touching his hands while the social worker watched from the corner. She kept saying she remembered pieces now. Bill telling her Carter was dangerous, needed pills to control him, couldn't be trusted. Her hands shook as she described waking up confused with Bill standing over her bed, holding water and more pills. The FBI Financial Crimes Unit started looking at Bill's accounts after finding transfers between states involving his ex-wife's money. They didn't tell Bill they were investigating, but agents showed up at the bank requesting 5 years of records. Carter had to testify at the closed custody hearing in the old courthouse on Market Street. The judge wasn't one of Bill's friends this time and actually listened while Carter described the searches and beatings. Bill's lawyer kept trying to make Carter look crazy, but the medical reports from the hospital showed old fractures and bruises in different healing stages. 3 days later, Dr. Morrison got arrested at his medical practice for illegal prescriptions. Federal agents walked him out in handcuffs while patients watched from the waiting room. Facing 20 years and losing his license forever, Morrison flipped immediately and gave investigators boxes of receipts. He showed them text messages where Bill asked for specific drugs to keep Susan sedated and offered cash payments through his ex-wife's account. Week 20. The FBI showed up at Bill's house with a federal warrant while I watched from across the street with Carter and his aunt. They carried out computers and boxes while Bill stood on his lawn yelling about his rights. The agents found hundreds of videos on his computer labeled with dates and degrading titles showing Carter during the body searches. They also found bank documents showing Bill had been moving money from Susan's accounts to his kids from his first marriage. Bill kept shouting that everything was legal as her husband, but the agents just kept loading evidence bags into their van. Susan's new doctor at the county hospital started managing her medication properly for the first time in over a year. She remembered more each day, including Bill putting powder in her coffee and changing papers while she was unconscious. She told investigators about the night her first husband died and how Bill showed up at the house within 10 minutes, even though nobody had called him yet. Carter stayed with his aunt, but woke up screaming most nights about Bill coming for him. His new therapist, Dr. Williams, worked with him on breathing exercises, but Carter still checked closets and under beds looking for guns that weren't there. He'd sit in the corner of rooms where he could see all the doors and jumped whenever car doors slammed outside. Week 22. The local news picked up the story after the federal raid with the headline about a respected officer under investigation. Parents who had signed Bill's petition started calling to apologize to Carter and his aunt. The grocery store clerk who'd given Bill information about Carter's schedule told everyone she felt terrible. The town split between people defending Bill and others, finally admitting they'd seen things, but stayed quiet. Bill made bail using his pension money and immediately filed for emergency custody of Susan, claiming she wasn't mentally competent. But the nurse, Patricia, who'd been giving Susan the overdoses, testified about Bill's instructions to keep her sedated. Susan stood up in court clearer than she'd been in 2 years and told the judge she wanted a divorce and restraining order. Bill's lawyer argued Susan was too damaged to make decisions, but she answered every question the judge asked about dates and details. 3 nights later, I woke up to sirens screaming past my window and saw the orange glow coming from Lisa's neighborhood where Carter was staying. The garage was already half gone when I got there, flames reaching toward the main house where Carter and his aunt slept. Firefighters were spraying everything down while Carter stood on the lawn in his pajamas, shaking. Lisa's security camera caught someone in dark clothes pouring something around the garage doors around 2 a.m., but the face was covered. The build looked exactly like Bill's though. Same shoulders, same walk. Bill's lawyer showed up within an hour with receipts proving Bill was at a hotel bar until 3 a.m. with 2 witnesses who happened to be off-duty cops. The FBI agent who'd been working the case pulled me aside and showed me photocopies of brochures they'd found in Bill's desk drawer during the raid. Whispering Pines Mental Health Facility, a private place 3 states away that specialized in long-term care for treatment-resistant patients. Bill had highlighted sections about power of attorney and permanent commitment procedures. The dates on the inquiry forms were from 6 months before Carter's dad died. There were notes in Bill's handwriting about Susan's deteriorating mental state and danger to herself, written when she was still completely normal. Carter started going to Ms. Huang's peer advocacy group at school, standing up in front of other kids and talking about what happened to him. 3 other students came forward that week, saying they were going through similar stuff at home. One girl started crying when Carter described the gaslighting, said she thought she was going crazy until she heard him talk. Ms. Huang pulled Carter aside after and told him he was brave, but Carter just looked tired and said he was done being quiet. Week 24 came, and Susan finally left the rehab facility, moving straight to her sister's place 2 hours away from Millbrook. She'd gained weight back, her hands didn't shake anymore, and she could look people in the eye again. She wrote Carter letters every day, pages and pages trying to explain how Bill had gotten into her head, how the pills made everything fuzzy, how sorry she was. The letters piled up unopened in Carter's desk drawer at Lisa's house. The fire investigator came back with his report, showing the burn patterns matched exactly what they teach at Police Academy arson investigation training. The accelerant pour pattern, the ignition point, even the timing matched Bill's old training materials they'd pulled from his personnel file. Not enough for charges since anyone could learn that stuff online, but Detective Torres told Carter and Lisa they should find somewhere else to stay for a while. 2 weeks later, Bill showed up at Carter's new school during lunch, standing by the fence watching the courtyard. He told the security guard he just wanted to talk to his stepson about family matters. Carter saw him through the cafeteria window and his whole body locked up, couldn't breathe, started hyperventilating so bad the nurse had to give him oxygen. The security footage showed Bill had been there since 7 a.m., just waiting. His lawyer claimed it was a misunderstanding, that Bill thought the restraining order only covered the old school, but the judge added new charges anyway. Bill showing up at Carter's new school at 7 a.m. like some creepy morning jogger who forgot to jog, that's dedication to being the worst. Margaret flew in from Arizona to testify in person, brought 3 boxes of medical records showing the exact same pattern from when she was married to Bill. The Xanax prescriptions that kept increasing, the Ambien added on top, the psychiatrist friend who diagnosed her with disorders she didn't have, bank statements showing money disappearing, Bill's name appearing on accounts, property transfers she didn't remember signing. The prosecutor started building what he called a pattern of predatory behavior case, showing Bill had done this multiple times. Week 26 arrived, and Frank drove Carter to the cemetery for the first time since everything started. Carter stood at his dad's headstone for 20 minutes without saying anything, then pulled his Eagle Scout badge from his pocket and set it on top of the granite. Frank heard him whisper something about protecting Mom now, about understanding why his dad tried to fight back. Frank put his hand on Carter's shoulder, and they stood there until the sun started setting. Bill's cop friends stopped returning his calls after the news about Margaret's testimony spread. The department suspended him without pay pending investigation, then fired him completely when the FBI shared their findings. His pension disappeared, his benefits gone, 20 years of service wiped out. People saw him at Murphy's bar every night, drinking whiskey alone and talking to himself about ungrateful kids and backstabbing friends. The bartender said he kept saying everyone would be sorry, that they didn't know who they were messing with. Then the FBI found Jennifer, not Margaret, not Susan, but another woman from 20 years ago when Bill was just starting as a cop in Ohio. She died from an overdose of the exact same drugs that killed Carter's dad, found in her garage with the car running. Bill had been her boyfriend, had just gotten a life insurance payout of $200,000 after her death. The case had been ruled a suicide, closed within a week, no real investigation. The detective who'd signed off on it was Bill's academy roommate. The FBI tracked down Jennifer's sister in Oregon, who'd been keeping a box of Jennifer's letters for 20 years. She handed over everything without hesitation, told the agents she'd always known Bill killed her sister, but nobody would listen to a teenager back then. The letters described Bill's control patterns exactly like what Carter went through, the medication doses increasing, the isolation from family, the way he'd twist every conversation to to make Jennifer doubt herself. 3 victims across 2 decades using the same playbook every time. The toxicology expert the FBI brought in spent 2 days reviewing Carter's dad's autopsy files and found something the original coroner missed or ignored. The drug combination in his system would have required someone else to administer at least part of it, since the sedatives would have knocked him out before he could take the rest. Not enough for a murder charge on its own, but it raised enough questions that the county had to reopen the case. Susan was staying with her sister now, 3 weeks clean from the pills, and she called me crying one night about remembering things she'd blocked out. The night Carter's dad died, Bill had made her take double her usual sleeping pills, said she looked stressed and needed rest. She'd woken up around 3 in the morning to use the bathroom and Bill wasn't in bed, then heard him come in the back door at 4, claiming he'd been watching TV downstairs the whole time. She'd been too drugged to process it then, but now it made her sick. Carter started at a new school 2 districts over where Lisa had moved them both for safety. Nobody there knew about Bill or the trial or any of it, just saw him as the quiet new kid who was good at math. He made friends with some kids in his chemistry class who invited him to play basketball after school. For the first time in years, he was just Carter, not the kid with the dead dad and psycho stepdad. The federal prosecutor met with Bill's lawyer to offer 15 years if he'd confessed to the fraud and abuse charges, avoid a trial that would destroy what was left of his reputation. Bill fired his lawyer on the spot, told the prosecutor he'd represent himself because his connections would get him off like they always had. The prosecutor just shook his head and left. Bill's mother put up her house for his bail again, swearing her son was innocent, and he walked out that same afternoon. That night, Carter's phone rang from Bill's number, just breathing at first, then Bill's voice saying this wasn't over before the line went dead. The FBI traced it to a gas station 3 blocks from Lisa's new address. They increased protection immediately, but everyone knew Bill had cop friends who'd tell him anything. Dr. Morrison finally cracked under pressure and admitted Bill had asked him about untraceable drug combinations 6 months before Carter's dad died, claimed it was for a case he was working. Morrison had given him a whole list, thinking it was theoretical, never imagining Bill would actually use it. The prosecutor added it to the growing pile of circumstantial evidence. Carter told Dr. Brown he wanted to testify at trial, no matter how hard it would be, because someone needed to say out loud that Bill killed his dad. Dr. Brown worried about the trauma, but Carter was determined, spent hours practicing his testimony, keeping his voice steady when describing the worst parts. Susan's divorce went through without Bill even showing up to contest it, since he was too focused on his criminal defense. She got the house, what was left in the accounts he hadn't drained, and started going to NA meetings every morning to stay clean. She'd call Carter every night to apologize, to promise she'd be the mom she should have been all along. Then Lisa found the black rose on her windshield with a note that said, "Widows understand loss." The FBI pulled security footage showing Bill's car in the parking garage, even though his mother swore he'd been with her all evening. Her neighbor had seen him leave 2 hours earlier, but his mother kept lying for him. The investigation was building momentum, but Bill was still out there, still dangerous, still convinced he'd win like he always had. The trial started 3 weeks later in federal court downtown. Bill decided to represent himself, which the judge warned him against twice before letting him proceed. During jury selection, Bill stood there in his cheap suit rejecting anyone who looked like they might have teenage kids, anyone who frowned when they looked at him, anyone who seemed too educated. The prosecutor kept building her jury quietly, picking people who nodded when she asked about patterns of behavior, who understood that abuse wasn't always bruises you could see. Bill thought he was winning each time someone got dismissed, didn't notice the prosecutor's small smile when certain jurors stayed. Opening statements came next morning. Bill went first, pacing in front of the jury box, talking about troubled boys and family tragedy, about how he'd tried to save a kid with his father's mental illness, how Carter had attacked him multiple times, how Susan needed protection from her own son. He showed photos of that tiny cut on his forehead from when Carter pushed him, talked for 40 minutes about sacrifice and ungrateful children. The prosecutor stood up slowly, walked to the center of the courtroom, and started listing names. Jennifer Hayes, dead at 32. Margaret Foster, escaped after 3 years. Susan Mitchell, drugged into compliance. 20 years of destroyed lives, she said. 3 suspicious deaths. Systematic abuse disguised as love. She had boxes of evidence wheeled in, each one labeled with a year, starting from 2004. Bill's face went white when he saw them. That night before Carter testified, I stayed with him at the safe house where they'd moved him. He couldn't sleep, kept getting up to check the locks, sitting back down, getting up again. Around 3 in the morning, he pulled out his phone and showed me videos I'd never seen. His dad teaching him to tie fishing flies, both of them laughing when Carter dropped one in the water. His dad's voice saying, "It's okay, buddy, we'll make another one." More videos of camping trips, baseball practice, his dad reading him books before bed, regular dad stuff that seemed precious now because it was gone. Carter kept pausing them, rewinding, like he was trying to memorize his dad's voice. The next morning, Susan testified first. She looked different, clearer somehow. 3 months of real therapy instead of Bill's pills showing in her eyes. She described waking up from the medication fog slowly, remembering remembering things in pieces, finding her husband's body, but not remembering the days before clearly. Bill always there with water and pills, whenever she started to remember too much. She talked about the therapy sessions Bill made her skip, the friends he drove away, the bank accounts he controlled. When she described how Bill had comforted her at her husband's funeral while probably being his killer, 3 jurors were crying. Bill tried to object 6 times, but the judge kept overruling him. Then Carter took the stand. He sat up straight, looked right at Bill, and started talking. Not emotional, just facts. The beatings that started 3 months after the wedding. The body searches Bill called safety checks. The places Bill touched him during those checks. The things Bill said about his father while hitting him. The recordings Bill made of him naked. The way Bill would hurt him for hours, then call him down for family dinner like nothing happened. Bill tried to cross-examine him, standing too close, raising his voice, but Carter didn't flinch. When Bill asked why anyone should believe a troubled kid with a family history of mental illness, Carter looked him straight in the eye. The whole courtroom went silent. Bill started to ask another question, but Carter kept staring at him, waiting. Bill's own mother lying about where he was that night while he's leaving black roses on windshields? I'm curious why she's still covering for him after seeing all this evidence pile up. What hold does he have over her? Bill's hands started shaking. He asked about the rifle in the closet, trying to make Carter look dangerous, but Carter just explained how he'd thought about using it on himself, not Bill, because that's what Bill had made him believe he deserved. 2 jurors had to leave the room. When Bill kept pushing, voice getting louder, asking why Carter's father was so weak, why he'd chosen drugs over his family, Carter stood up in the witness box. The judge told him to sit, but Carter kept standing, looking down at Bill, and that's when Bill lost it completely, screaming about weak men and ungrateful sons, about how Carter's father was pathetic, deserved what happened to him. The judge called for order, but Bill kept screaming, had to be physically removed by bailiffs while shouting that Carter would end up just like his worthless father. The jury saw everything, saw the real Bill finally. Margaret testified the next day by video link from Seattle, too scared to be in the same room as Bill even with armed guards. She described the exact same patterns from 15 years ago, the pills, the isolation, the beatings in places that wouldn't show, the financial control, her ex-husband's suspicious death. Jennifer's sister testified after her, talking about finding journals Jennifer hid before she died, documenting abuse, fear, plans to escape that never happened. Even Bill's own mother took the stand for the prosecution. She broke down admitting she hadn't been with Bill the night of the Rose incident, that he'd told her to lie or she'd never see him again, that he'd been controlling her too for years, taking her social security checks, threatening to put her in a home. She looked at Bill and said she was sorry for what she'd created. Closing arguments took 2 days. The prosecutor connected every piece, showing 20 years of calculation, 3 families destroyed, a pattern of predatory behavior that would have continued forever if Carter hadn't finally broken the silence. She showed the jury photos of bruises, medical records, bank statements, prescription bottles, a timeline of systematic destruction. Bill's closing was a mess, rambling about conspiracy theories, everyone out to get him, ungrateful women and lying children, the system persecuting a good man. He pointed at Carter and said he'd tried to save him from becoming like his father. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they came back, the foreman stood up with the verdict: guilty on all federal charges, wire fraud, conspiracy, domestic abuse across state lines, violating the Violence Against Women Act, using interstate commerce to commit abuse, 25 to life minimum, state murder charges still pending. Bill screamed about appeals as they dragged him out, yelling that Carter had ruined everything, that his father had deserved to die, that he'd get out and finish what he started. The courtroom doors closed on his voice. Carter stood there for a long moment, then walked over to his mom, and they held each other while everyone else filed out. 6 weeks passed before the prosecutor called with news about the murder charges. The state had reviewed all the evidence from Bill's trial, the pattern of control, the forged prescriptions that kept Susan sedated, and decided they had enough for first-degree murder. They believed Bill had deliberately overdosed Carter's father with the same drugs he'd been feeding Susan, staging it to look like suicide. The medical examiner found inconsistencies in the original autopsy report that Bill's cop friends had pushed through too quickly. Susan agreed to testify again, even though her hands shook when she signed the papers. Carter wouldn't have to face Bill this time since victims' rights laws protected him from having to see his abuser again. 3 months later, Carter and Susan sat in a family therapist's office for the first time. Susan had been living with her sister, 6 months clean from the cocktail of pills Bill had kept her on, working part-time at a daycare center. She cried when she saw how thin Carter had gotten, how his shoulders stayed tense even sitting down. The therapist helped them talk about the small things first, favorite foods, TV shows they used to watch together, before they could even approach the harder stuff. Carter's grades started improving once he could actually focus on school instead of survival. His story had gone viral after the trial, and several colleges reached out with scholarship offers. He picked a small state school 3 hours away, close enough that Frank could drive up for weekend visits, but far enough to start over where nobody knew him as the kid whose stepdad tried to destroy his family. The murder trial took 8 months from start to verdict. The evidence was mostly circumstantial but overwhelming when laid out together. Bill's first wife testified about similar patterns of control, his obsession with Carter's father's life, the way he'd talked about wanting everything his friend had. The jury took 4 hours to come back with guilty, life without parole. Bill's appeals got denied within weeks. His mother had to sell her house to pay his legal bills and moved into assisted living. Carter spoke at a conference about recognizing abuse 9 months after the verdict. He stood at the podium with note cards he never looked at and told 300 people how Bill had made everyone doubt reality, how the signs were there but hidden behind a badge and a smile. He talked about trusting your instincts when something feels wrong, even if everyone tells you you're crazy. A year after the trial, Susan moved back into their house. She'd repainted every room, replaced all the furniture, turned Bill's office into a craft room. She worked as a teacher's aide now and sponsored 2 other women trying to leave abusive relationships. Some days were still hard. She still flinched at unexpected sounds, but she was present in a way she hadn't been for years. Frank set up a scholarship in his son's name for students who'd overcome family trauma. At the ceremony, he asked Carter to be the first recipient. Carter spoke about his real father, the man who coached Little League and volunteered at shelters, who taught him to tie fishing flies and change oil, who loved his family more than anything. The check would cover his first 2 years of college. Carter and I stayed close through school. He majored in social work, determined to help kids recognize the signs he'd missed. Some nights he'd call me at 2 a.m., nightmares about finding the rifle still in his closet, about what might have happened if I hadn't knocked on his door that day. His therapist taught him breathing exercises and grounding techniques that mostly worked. 18 months after the verdict, Susan got a German Shepherd from the rescue shelter. She named her Hope, which felt a little on the nose, but Carter didn't say anything. He helped train her on his monthly visits home, teaching her to bark at strangers, to sleep by Susan's bed, to be the protection they'd never had before. They'd built something new from what Bill had tried to destroy, different than before, but stronger in some ways. 2 years after learning the truth about his father's death, Carter stood at the grave for the first time since the funeral. Susan stood beside him, the first time she'd been able to come here. They planted yellow roses, his father's favorite, in the permanent vase the cemetery provided. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Susan said quietly that they'd survived, that his father would be proud of how strong Carter had become. Carter nodded, finally able to imagine a future that wasn't just about getting through each day. They walked back to their separate cars together, not yet whole, but no longer broken, ready to keep building the lives Bill had tried to steal from them. Time to close the book on this one, folks. Appreciate you letting me toss in my trademark wit and wisdom today. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.